Imagine it's the middle of winter, no firewood, no electricity, just cold stone walls, frozen air, and the will to survive. Medieval people faced this exact reality every single year, and somehow they stayed warm. But how? In this video, we're diving into 10 brilliant heating hacks medieval folks used when firewood was gone or simply not enough. From compost heat to baked clothing, these forgotten tricks weren't just clever. They were the difference between frostbite and survival, and some of them might just work today. Compost heat. Warming up with rot. In the coldest corners of medieval life, survival sometimes meant turning to the most unlikely sources of warmth, including piles of rotting material. It wasn't random. Medieval villagers understood that decomposition produces heat, so when firewood ran low or the winter dragged on longer than expected, they turned to compost. Not the kind you see in neat garden bins today, but massive, steaming piles of straw, manure, kitchen scraps, and leaves built on purpose to generate warmth. These compost heaps could reach temperatures of 60 degrees, 140 degrees as they broke down. Peasants placed them strategically behind walls, near sleeping quarters, or even just outside livestock pens, and they used that warmth. Some homes had stone benches or compartments pressed against the compost side of the house to absorb radiant heat. Others dug shallow pits next to compost mounds, lined them with straw, and used them for warming storage, keeping root vegetables from freezing and people from shivering. In especially harsh regions, some villagers even designed compost sheds, enclosed outbuildings where decomposing matter heated the space enough to serve as a workshop or emergency sleeping area. The smell wasn't exactly pleasant, but that wasn't the point. When temperatures dropped and the woodpile was empty, it wasn't fire that kept people alive. It was fermentation. Modern permaculture and greenhouse growers still use this principle today. Heat from compost piles helps regulate soil temperature and protect crops. But for medieval people, it wasn't sustainability. It was necessity. Rot kept them warm when fire couldn't. Baked clothes, preheating what you wear. When your house is freezing and there's no fire to spare, you don't try to heat the air, you heat your body. That was the logic behind one of the simplest, most brilliant tricks medieval people used: warming their clothes before wearing them. Instead of wasting precious wood heating an entire room, peasants found ways to apply heat where it counted most. After baking bread or stew, they'd place their shirts, cloaks, or boots inside the still warm oven. The retained heat would soften the fabrics, drive out any dampness, and create a sudden surge of comfort when worn. On especially frigid days, this small gesture made the difference between movement and misery. Some homes kept a warming shelf, a slab of stone or clay near the hearth specifically for drying and heating clothes. Others used heated bricks or stones wrapped in cloth, pressing them into garments or bedding to pre-warm specific areas, like sleeves or boots. Wool garments held the heat well, and even rough linen felt welcoming when warmed from within. This method extended to bedtime as well. Cloaks or underlayers were laid over the ashes of the fire after cooking, so when it was time to sleep, they retained just enough heat to ease the transition into a cold bed. More than comfort, this practice protected the body. In regions where frostbite was common and hypothermia could kill within hours, warming clothes wasn't indulgent, it was strategic. It helped muscles stay limber, kept fingers from stiffening, and gave people the psychological edge to get through the worst months. Today, we use electric blankets and heated floors. Back then, it was just a warm tunic pulled from a bread oven, and sometimes that was enough to carry you through the cold. Dark stone heat banks. Passive solar heating, before it had a name. In the medieval world, not every village was blessed with endless firewood. But sunlight? That was free. And some of the cleverest heating tricks came not from fire, but from how they used the sun itself. Without understanding the science of thermal mass or infrared absorption, medieval people had already mastered a primitive version of what we now call passive solar heating. The method? Simple, silent, and surprisingly effective. They used dark stones to soak up sunlight during the day and release it slowly after nightfall. Homes and outbuildings were often constructed with dark-colored stone or earth-based materials, not just because it was available, but because it worked. South-facing walls, where the sun hit hardest in winter, were either darkened with soot or built from materials that naturally absorbed more heat. Inside the home, benches, low stone ledges, or even walls themselves were warmed throughout the day simply by exposure to light. Some villagers took this idea further. They arranged small courtyards with flat black stones specifically positioned to catch sunlight, especially in winter when the sun hung lower in the sky. At night, these stones emitted stored heat, keeping the surrounding air just a few degrees warmer, enough to make a difference in drafty kitchens or sleeping areas. Others used what we'd now call solar traps, glass panes made from sanded horn, oiled paper, or animal membrane stretched over frames. These let sunlight pass but trapped warm air inside small window alcoves. It wasn't high-tech, but it was highly effective. The science would come centuries later. But medieval families already knew. If you couldn't make a fire, you could borrow heat from the sun and store it in stone. Sleeping with the animals. The warmest room wasn't yours. To modern ears, it sounds unsanitary or even desperate. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping near animals wasn't a last resort. It was an intentional heating system, one that required no firewood at all. Livestock produced constant body heat, especially cows, pigs, goats, and even chickens. So instead of isolating them in cold barns, many peasant homes were built with integrated stables, placing animals under the same roof, often separated only by a low wooden partition or packed earthen wall. This wasn't random. Builders knew what they were doing. Heat from animals, especially large ones like oxen or cows, would radiate into the living space, warming the air and sometimes even the floor, especially if the animals were kept slightly lower in elevation, in a shallow pit. Warm air rises, and peasants used that simple fact to their advantage. In alpine and northern regions, this setup became architectural tradition. Entire villages had homes known as house barns, where the family lived upstairs and the animals below. The floor separating them was made of thick wood or packed straw, allowing heat to pass through while blocking smells and noise as much as possible. The results were incredibly effective. In a time with no insulation, these homes could stay 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the outside air, without burning a single log. And it wasn't just about room temperature. Children, the elderly, and the sick were often given spots nearest to the stable wall, where the heat was strongest. Some families even designed sleeping platforms above the livestock pen, like a bunk bed over a living furnace. Of course, it came with downsides. The smell wasn't pleasant, the noise could be constant, and there was always the risk of disease. But in a bitter winter, when fuel was gone and temperatures dropped below freezing, those inconveniences didn't matter. Because for many medieval families, survival meant sharing your home with the hooves, the hay, and the heat. Layered straw beds and nesting pits, beating the cold from the ground up. If you've ever tried sleeping on a cold floor, you know it. The ground doesn't just feel cold, it steals your body heat. And in a medieval winter, that could be dangerous. But peasants knew this too, and they developed one of the smartest no-fire heating solutions of the age: layered straw beds and nesting pits. The logic was simple. If you couldn't heat the room and you couldn't heat the bed, you did the next best thing. Trap your own body heat and insulate yourself from the frozen ground. That's where straw came in. It was cheap, abundant, and shockingly effective. Straw bedding wasn't just a loose pile on the floor. It was layered carefully, sometimes over a base of packed earth, rugs, or even discarded clothing. Families built up thick nests of straw, topped with animal skins, wool blankets, or rough-spun linen. The idea was to create an insulated cocoon, a personal thermal pod centuries before sleeping bags. But it didn't stop there. In some homes, families dug shallow pits into the ground, just a few feet deep, and lined them with straw, dried moss, or fur. People would climb into these pits at night, curl into fetal positions, and cover themselves entirely. These heat traps worked astonishingly well. With multiple people inside, the shared body heat was enough to keep temperatures survivable even during snowstorms. Children and the elderly were often placed in the center of the nest while others slept around them, forming a living barrier against the cold air. It wasn't comfortable, but it worked. And in homes with no firewood, every layer of straw could mean the difference between life and frostbite. Modern survivalists call this the principle of insulation and clustering. Medieval peasants called it bedtime. Insulated seating, heated stones and hay cushions. When you're cold, even sitting down can feel like a punishment, especially if the bench beneath you is made of stone or wood soaked in winter chill. Medieval people understood this well. That's why they didn't just focus on beds and walls. They brought heat to their seats, too. Enter the world of insulated cushions, straw pads, and heated stones. Small, brilliant hacks that made life just a little more bearable during freezing months. In many peasant homes, seating was rudimentary. Wooden benches, stone slabs, or simple stools. But those surfaces became heat drains when the fire was out. To fix that, villagers crafted cushions filled with straw, wool scraps, or hay, light, breathable materials that created a buffer between the cold surface and the human body. Some took it a step further. Before sitting, they would place flat stones in the fire or near hot ashes, then wrap them in cloth or tuck them inside hollowed-out straw cushions. The result? A primitive heated seat that kept the legs and lower back warm for hours. In larger homes or communal spaces, there were even heat benches, built directly against kitchen hearths or warm interior walls. These spots became gathering areas not just for socializing, but for preserving core body temperature, especially for elders or small children. And these tricks weren't limited to humans. In colder regions, livestock pens had insulated milking stools and resting platforms layered with hay, not for comfort, but to keep the animals healthy and producing. When modern survival experts talk about heat zones and conserving core warmth, this is what they mean. But medieval folks figured it out with nothing more than a rock, a fire, and a handful of straw. Sometimes it wasn't about heating the house. It was about making where you sat survivable. Body heat clusters, strategic sleeping positions. When temperatures dropped and there was no firewood left, medieval families didn't rely on blankets alone. They relied on each other. Sleeping wasn't just about rest. It was a coordinated act of survival, and body heat became the most valuable heat source in the house. Most homes didn't have private rooms or individual beds. Instead, families slept together in tight clusters, often in a single room or even on the same straw mat. But this wasn't just for space. It was deliberate. People positioned themselves in ways that maximized warmth and minimized exposure. The elderly or youngest children were placed in the middle, surrounded by stronger adults who could handle colder edges. Sometimes they slept in a circle, knees to backs, forming a human nest where everyone's core heat contributed to the whole. In colder regions, records describe families sleeping chest to back in chains, like sardines packed for warmth, not for comfort, but efficiency. Even the way they wrapped themselves mattered. Layers of shared wool, cloaks, and animal skins were spread across multiple people instead of one, trapping heat in a shared microclimate. And when temperatures were especially brutal, domestic animals, dogs, goats, or even chickens, were brought into the cluster too, turning the group into a literal body-powered furnace. Sleeping this way also reduced the need for additional fuel. Instead of trying to heat a room, you heated the space under the covers, concentrating warmth where it counted. It also built a rhythm into the night. People shifted together, breathed together, and endured together. It may seem unthinkable today, in an age of heated mattresses and personal space. But for medieval families facing frost with no fire, the only insulation they had was each other. And in those frozen hours before dawn, body heat wasn't just comfort. It was everything. Tapestries, wall carpets, and ceiling drapes, warming the room without fire. When we picture medieval castles or manors, we often imagine grand tapestries hanging on the walls, scenes of battles, forests, or noble coats of arms. But those embroidered masterpieces weren't just decoration. They were also a form of insulation, designed to fight the one enemy no lord or peasant could ignore: the cold. In thick-stoned buildings, especially castles or large rural homes, stone walls acted like ice blocks in winter, absorbing and holding cold for days. Lighting a fire helped, but much of the heat vanished into the walls or up through the ceiling. That's where textiles came in. Tapestries, furs, and thick woven carpets were hung on walls, placed over doors and even draped from the ceiling, not just to impress guests, but to trap heat inside. These layers created a buffer between the room's interior and the icy walls. Some households used multiple layers, first wool, then felt, then embroidered cloth, each one blocking a bit more chill and keeping more warmth in. In noble homes, bed canopies served the same purpose. Thick curtains were drawn around beds at night, turning them into private microclimates. Heat from the body would gather and stay, rather than dispersing into open air. This wasn't about elegance. It was a response to freezing interiors where the fire burned out by midnight and frost crept through the cracks. Even humbler homes used this idea. In the absence of fancy cloth, old blankets, sacks, or stitched-together scraps were hung on walls and doors. Some families draped furs or hides from the rafters to block drafts coming down from uninsulated ceilings. These textiles didn't generate heat, but they protected every degree the body or the hearth managed to produce. And when firewood was gone, those extra degrees could mean the world. Residual kitchen heat, sleeping by the stove. In a medieval home, the kitchen wasn't just a place to cook. It was often the only room guaranteed to be warm, at least for part of the day, and when firewood was scarce, medieval families learned to squeeze every last ember of heat from it. The key was simple. When the fire went out, the heat didn't. Stone hearths, brick ovens, and even iron cauldrons retained warmth for hours after cooking was done. So instead of wasting precious wood to heat other rooms, people brought themselves closer to where the warmth already was. Some homes had built-in benches along the hearth wall, where family members, especially children or the elderly, would curl up to sleep once the evening fire had burned down. In smaller cottages, the entire family might lay bedding right on the kitchen floor, huddled around the last warmth of the stove or fire pit. They didn't just rely on the fire's flame, they used the thermal mass of the structure itself. Thick walls around the hearth would soak in heat during cooking, slowly releasing it overnight. Some even buried heated stones in the ashes, then pulled them out later, wrapped in cloth, to warm the feet, the bed, or even the inside of a cloak. Everything had a second use. The pot that cooked soup was filled with hot water again, and set beside a bedroll. The baking oven, still warm after bread making, became a place to dry boots, gloves, or even nap, tucked close to the opening. When wood was gone and the nights were long, the kitchen became more than a room. It was a lifeboat of heat, a space where survival, nourishment, and warmth came together one last time before darkness fully set in. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't comfort. It was strategy, and it kept them alive until morning, the warmth they fought for. When we think of surviving winter, we picture roaring fires and thick blankets. But for medieval people, warmth wasn't a given. It was something they earned day by day through cleverness, resourcefulness, and sheer will. They used compost as heaters, slept in nests of straw, shared warmth with animals, and captured sunlight in stone. Their lives weren't comfortable, but they were creative. And in a time when firewood ran out, they didn't give up. They got smarter. Today, with power grids stretched and winters growing harsher, maybe some of their solutions aren't so outdated after all. Which one of these could you use?